Hey everybody! So I promised in our WebEx that I would create a video where I take what you've gotten through so far and kind of give it some value to look what you're looking forward to as we get into the American Revolution, which is the chapter you're in right now. Which is just crazy that you're in there so fast. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview and on the WebEx meeting on Thursday. If you have any questions, by all means, throw them at me. All right, so now, American history. First thing we did, we talked about Native Americans. Native Americans, super big deal, super big deal. Of course, it's a big deal because they are the people who crossed the Bering Strait or came here via boats, small boats, into North America through Beringia, eventually going down into Meso and South America. And they were here creating a life. And they were in communities which are very, very different from European communities. And we're going to see the culture clash. This is a real big deal as we go forward. Native Americans have no concept of private land ownership. No concept really of private land ownership. They have a concept of land ownership, but it's community. The community owns the land. The community owns the land. Women are the farmers. Now, in societies where you have a concept of community-based land ownership, they're very different from the concepts of private land ownership. And it's a very interesting thing to kind of look at because in history, we know that human beings lived in small bands and they were hunters and gatherers. And at some point, around 10,000 years ago in the Neolithic Revolution, came the concept of farming, agriculture, horticulture. And with that farming and really the technology of irrigation, first time anyone's ever controlled a natural resource, which was water, came with, we have our agriculture now. With agriculture, we have a surplus in food, which is a very big deal. But from hunters and gatherers here to agriculture here, something happened and there was a split. And in this split over here, you have this concept of private land ownership. Private land ownership. This is where the Europeans are, private land ownership. So in the world where there's private land ownership is the concept of social hierarchies where it is a patriarchal society. Men rule over the women. The Europeans, by the time they meet with the Native Americans, they are ruled through civil law and canon law, which is religious law. And in almost all cases, except when we look at the Dutch, women have no rights. No rights. They are completely subject to whatever the men in their life, either their fathers, their brothers if they've never married, or their husbands if they have married, tell them what to do, and they are theoretically expected to do it. Does it always happen? Of course not. But that is the rule. That's the rule. Women can't keep their own wages if they do any work. They can't own property by themselves. They can't have bank accounts. They can't do business. They can't do anything. And so women are the weaker sex, the weaker vessel, and men are the rulers. Totally different, diametrically different than Native Americans, because Native Americans come on this concept of community land ownership, and in that situation, no matter where you are in the world, you have equal gender power differentials. Definitely gender roles are different, but power differentials the same. Most Native American societies are matrilineal. Most Native American societies that the Europeans are coming to, the male is a chief, but it's the female council, the women's council, who votes on who the chief is going to be. So the men put forth a name, the women vote to say yes or no. If the men want to make war, they have to go to the women's council for approval. So the power differentials between the two are very, very similar. Very similar. Whoa, what a cultural conflict before they even meet. Big deal. So Native Americans are there. When the Europeans come, what do you think they're going to think of the Native American men? They're weak. What do? Native American men are the hunters. Once they go hunting, then they can play. The women take care of skinning. The men help as well, but they skin, they farm. Women doing so much of the work that the European men think that the Native American men are lazy and no good for nothing, and they just don't get it. They simply don't get it. So right off the bat, there's going to be a problem and a conflict. And yet, Native Americans still very much help the Europeans. I guess because most of the Europeans come over and they don't know what the heck they're doing, and the Native Americans feel sorry for them. And that is certainly the case with the earliest group of Europeans, which is going to be the Plymouth, the Mayflower group of pilgrims, as well as Jamestown. As a matter of fact, Jamestown initially would never even be spoken of. It would have been like Roanoke, another failed colony, had the Powhatans not come in to help them. Completely unprepared. So, you have the Native Americans who are going to find cultural clashes with the Europeans. Another thing that's important about them is that, you notice that they don't have weapons like the Europeans. And you're like, well, why in the world wouldn't they have weapons like Europeans? Because they didn't need them. Necessity is the mother of invention. And the Native Americans had everything they needed. Everything that was necessary to make their lives what they wanted, how they wanted to live, was available. They had food, abundance of food all around them. And they had a very, very strong kinship, relationships, and ties with each other. Totally lived off the land and were very happy for the most part. The biggest issues that came between Native Americans was over land, crossing over each other's boundaries, and primarily, they fought over land. Now, they didn't always, and land meaning resources. And usually, not always, but usually Native Americans didn't fight to kill. So big deal, very big deal. And one of your extra credits that you're going to see by the end of this week is a documentary directed by Ken Burns called Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. And what I want you to really look at when you're looking at that is, what was the role of Sacagawea? And also there was a woman in the Pacific Coast tribe who also saved those dudes. So, think about that. All right? Rarely do we ever hear about them or really understand what Sacagawea gave and helped the Lewis and Clark expedition with. So very interesting. Nevertheless, we have these Native Americans who, this is their land. Europeans come in for two reasons, right? Your discussion board question is asking you about those. It's religion and money. Money. So Jamestown, like I said, Jamestown would never have kept itself together if it hadn't been for Native Americans, for the Powhatans. But of course, eventually they kill off the Powhatans. Why? Because they keep encroaching on the Powhatans' land. That's why. The Powhatans, when Jamestown people came in and eventually settled and created this colony, what was their cash crop? What did I hear? Tobacco? Yes, tobacco. And so what do you need in order to grow tobacco? Land. So initially, the Native Americans actually helped the Jamestown folks and showed them how to grow tobacco, plant tobacco, grow tobacco. And then the more the Europeans were encroaching, the Native Americans were like, hey man, hey dude, we're out of here. We're not helping you anymore because we can see that you are hungry for what we have. You are selfish and you are hungry for what we have, and we're leaving. We're not helping you anymore. And then what did the Europeans do? They say, oh, well, let's go to Great Britain and see if we can find some more labor to help us with this. So what does the first group that they tried to get, all the way up to 1619, they tried to get white indentured servants. White indentured servants. Now, some of these indentures didn't actually want to come to the colonies. Some of those indentures were people who were criminals, people who were prisoners of war from English wars. And so Great Britain was like, hey, we got this colony over there. We're going to send these bad dudes. Certainly the criminals were bad dudes. Not always the prisoners of war, but the criminals, we're going to send these dudes over to the colonies and we're going to make them an indentured servant, and that's how they're going to bide their time. But they're white. And so these indentured contracts were very, very labor heavy, especially if you were in the Chesapeake, which is what becomes the middle colonies eventually. Because of the tobacco and farming of tobacco. So now what's the next idea? Well, back this up. So what do those white indentured servants do? Well, they just get up and they walk away. They walk away. And they're white. And so they fit in, they blend in with the population. So what do the people in the Chesapeake do? Well, they learn from the Spaniards. And which is what brought them there to begin with. If the Spaniards got gold, let me look in the New World for some new gold too. I want to be like the Spaniards. So that's what the British do. They go, hey, let's bring some Africans here. Well, the first ship in 1619 was a group of Africans who came against their will, part of the Middle Passage, or what becomes the Middle Passage. But they are not slaves. Now I want to repeat this to everybody. They are not slaves. They are indentured servants. They are indentured servants. Now here's the deal with this. They're able to get up at the end of 7 years. They're just like any other indenture. They're able to leave. They have a part of the headright system. They get 50 acres, a mule, new clothes. And they are able to leave. And we have documentation of this. And this is around 1623, where we have the first understanding of Africans who come to this country, are forced here, who are sold to people, and they come to this country, but they're not slaves, not slaves. So the idea that inherently this country is racist, or that inherently this is always how it's been, it's not. And what is my point in telling you that? It's that it is learned. Racism is learned. And you're going to see that it's learned. It is a learned behavior that is sanctified by the laws that are created. And the laws in 1620s don't show anything on the books about people who are black. There's nothing. They can go, they move, They're able to live their life and get married and have children and own slaves and have indentured servants and be in courts and do business and do all the other things that everybody else can do. So what moves us to the ugliness that we eventually become? Because it's not inherent. It's not something that just comes natural. This is unnatural, and it is something we have learned and we have codified in the laws. So by 1620s to 1670s, over that time period, the rights of people who are black begin to diminish. One thing after another, slowly. You have about a 50-year stretch, or maybe a little bit less, but approximately a 50-year stretch, where you see one right removed after the other. You can't own a firearm. You can't be in court. You can't bring suit, or you cannot. You don't have legal rights in a court of law. You cannot participate in business on your own. You can't eventually own land, or you just slowly but surely the rights are whittled away, whittled away, whittled away. Now, that happens concurrently with the rise of the need for labor in the fields, and thusly the rise of more Africans coming against their will through the Middle Passage to meet the needs of those labor sources. And so by the time we get to 1705, the rights have so deteriorated for anyone who is black that in 1705 the first slave codes are created. These are codified laws in every single region of the Americas that define race and begin the systematic racism we see today. 1705. Look it all up. So in 1705, we see the Virginia law codes, and there are three pieces to it. Number one, it's tied to race. Race. Number one, if you're black, you are a slave. If you're black or brown, you are a slave. Another caveat, if your mother's a slave, then you are a slave. If your mother is a slave, you are a slave. Thomas Jefferson, he had a relationship with Sally Hemings. Some people might say it was love. Some people might say otherwise. I am not here to tell you which one it is, though he did let his sons go. He didn't even free them. It was a joke that in that time that Jefferson was the only slaveholder who had redhead slaves. Redheaded and light-skinned slaves. He was redheaded and had blue eyes, and Sally Hemings was three-quarter white. You could say she's almost the same color that Meghan Markle is. And look at their son Archie. This is what happened. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, who passed away, and he was madly in love with his wife. And anyway, he had 5 children with Sally Hemings. His 2 oldest sons came to him at different times in their life and took one of his horses and came up to the big house and said, I'm taking a horse and give me some money. And they let him go. And Thomas Jefferson let him go. So, and we know that this is for real because we have DNA evidence, and now even the estate of Thomas Jefferson, you can look it up, and you can actually see his entire family. Of course, for the longest time, the white part of that family did not acknowledge the black part of that family. And DNA, doesn't lie, and so now, and it really has been good for the whole family because they've all recognized each other. Now, So you had to be black in these. So race was the very first part of the codes. Second part of the codes, if your mama's a slave, then you're a slave. And the third part of that code is manumission, freedom. In order to gain your freedom, you had to be manumitted. It's a process by law that allows you to be free. And every single state that incorporated slavery had a different set of standards for manumission. So this is all codified in law. Codified. And you don't have to take my word for it. But certainly I bring this up because of what we're dealing with now. We have real social unrest in this country. But the only way you can really address the social unrest is by looking at the history. You can't put a Band-Aid on it. You can't make a you can't just say, oh, there's no racism, oh, or there's always been racism, or, it's not a one-sentence kind of thing. If you really want to create social change, you must get to the heart of it. You must understand where it comes from and that it is real. The issues that people face are real. So just keep that in mind. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. But I am bringing to you the history, the facts, the legal codification of these of what was slavery, and we're eventually going to see that those ingrained ideas of slavery are very much still with us today. So as you are reading right now about slavery, later on I'm going to do a mini lecture on slavery. We also are looking at, in the Chesapeake, tobacco is the cash crop. It's brown gold. So money is it's a really big motivator that brings people here. The Dutch come to New Amsterdam. And when they come to New Amsterdam and settle in New Amsterdam, one of the things that makes it such a great place, New Amsterdam, and consequently New York, Manhattan Island, is that the ports are deep. So the closer you get to the land, the ships can go dock right up to the land. Why? Because even if the ships are heavy and laden down, they're going to be heavy. They're going to displace more water. Well, if you have a really deep port and it's right up next to the land, how much easier is it to load and unload those kinds of ships? Voila, we have a deep port in Manhattan, and so Manhattan, beginning with the Dutch, and then eventually with the British, and even now, New York City, is all about trade. All about trade. From its very inception, it has the fundamental pieces to make it one of the best trading places on the planet. And as it grows, it gets more and more. Not only does it become a center for more and more trade, it also becomes a center for more and more diverse groups of people, because trade is not limited to one group of people. There's a lot of diversity in trade, and that is the great place that was and still is one of the best places for a diverse group of people to be. So naturally, organically, it grows that way. New England naturally, organically grows to be all about the fishing industry, about the lumber industry. Why? Because it's certainly not an agricultural place. There's sustenance farming, which means you have your gardens every year, and then that's what you can or you use through the winter. But most of what you have there, the industry there is going to be revolving around the fishing industry and the lumber industry and hardwoods, specifically hardwoods. Now, when you get further down we get into the middle colonies, New York and New Jersey and Delaware, Maryland, northern part of Virginia, that's the Chesapeake, the middle colonies. It's going to be about farming, but farming specifically with tobacco and then trade. That's going to be a very big deal, trade. and tobacco and coastal fishing. The southern colonies, as they grow, we're looking at agriculture, totally agriculturally based. Georgia and South Carolina is going to be rice and indigo, primarily rice and indigo, and then cotton. North Carolina, in its very beginnings, is not really tobacco. We don't see real tobacco in the Carolinas and Georgia till after the Civil War. But what you see before then in the Carolinas, from about what is the coastal basin, like around Pinehurst and just east of Raleigh, what you find there, it's all about tar. That's why we're the Tar Heel state. So it's all about pine tar and turpentine. So it's the pine trees that are really the money makers in North Carolina. And what do? They create turpentine and tar that the British primarily buy for their navy. And because they're inlets that come into North Carolina, they're also great places for smuggling and bringing in goods from around the world. So the southern colonies are really about agriculture and raw materials that are then sold. It's not manufacturing, raw materials that are sold. Keep in mind something really important. This happens just naturally, organically. These things are based off of the environment. The way they grow is based off of the environmental factors that go into them. Yes, also with the people that go into them, but definitely the environmental factors. So that's how the colonies develop. Now, there are two basic groups that really come in that we're going to focus on mostly, and that's going to be the French and the English. Now, the English, as you read in chapter 3, I think, which is about anglicizing America, anglicizing meaning British Europeans. But the French come in through Quebec and modern-day Canada, and they come in and they really enter into the fur trade, and it's men only and not families, and they come in and they slowly embed themselves in local Native American populations, which very much say, hey, come on. They marry local Native American women, and they build a fur trade. And they go down the Mississippi River into New Orleans eventually, because New Orleans is also French-owned. So it was originally Spanish territory, but it becomes French territory. Okay, so then there you have the English. Now the English are coming in. They're on the eastern seaboard. They're in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Carolinas. And they're moving west. They have to move west for more land. Well, the French and the English are right up next to each other. I mean, they're overlapping each other's land. And the French and the British really have always hated each other. This dealio. The French and the English never liked each other, so it's no different in this time. And so eventually, one of the things that leads to the 7 Years' War is this land ownership. It's a big hullabaloo that actually in 1763 leads to nothing, really. And a 7 Years' War is really a world war, but for our purposes, we're going to focus it on just a very simple thing, because this video is going forever. So basically, the English, the governor of Virginia thinks it's going to be a really great idea if speculators go out go west into like the Ohio River Valley and say, hey, we're claiming this land for Great Britain. And why do they want to do that? Because if the governor of Virginia does that, then he looks like he's all great and wonderful to the king, and he's kind of thrown the finger up at the French, that's really their land, supposedly. Well, it doesn't work out that way. And what ends up happening is that desire to be all that in a bag of chips to the king turns into the 7 Years' War. Now, originally, the Native Americans, the Iroquois and the Algonquin mostly with the French, Iroquois mostly with the English, they fight with the French and the English respectively. But then after a little while, they back out. And they're like, hey, let's let these European dudes fight this between themselves because, if they kill each other off, we'll go back to the way it was, and we're very happy with that. Well, eventually they see that the British are going to win, so the Iroquois come onto the side of the British, and the British win the war. Now, who brings the British army over? Well, of course, the governor of Virginia and other governors here in the Americas. They say, hey, come on over here and help us win this war. Well, since France is a big enemy of Great Britain, they go, okay. Now, up until that time, though, up until that request for soldiers, the colonies were growing and forming and developing on their own, and your textbook goes into this. So the British government, because the British had 1,000,001 things to deal with, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, they were living through a dumpster fire themselves. They prioritized what was important to them. And on the very bottom, pretty much, of their list of priorities was the American colonies. So they created a policy called salutary neglect, which means, you know what? I'm going to let you guys go because you're really British, you're part of us, but you're across the water, and I'm going to let you be, and we're going to deal with our dumpster fire over here, and then we'll get back to you. So what happens? Well, during the time that salutary neglect was being practiced in Great Britain, the American colonies were growing and developing with their own identity. They weren't really British. They were British citizens, but were they really, and British subjects were, but were they, they really began to create their own identity and their own concept of who they were, not based off of blood, but based off of ideology. And so most of the colonies slowly became more and more diverse. Trade slowly grew, and the colonies created each area, each colony created its own identity, to the point that people didn't call themselves I'm British. They would say I'm a North Carolinian, or I'm a Virginian, or I'm a Massachusetts man, or I'm a New Yorker. And we still do that today. All right? So we identify with the colony / eventually the state that we become. So this is what's happening over here in the colonies. We're growing, and we really begin to identify with our colony, not with Great Britain. So when the 7 Years' War is over, Great Britain says, hey, you know what? This war has cost me a penny or two. I need to get that money back, and since you are on our books British citizens and subjects, we're going to tax you. And because there was no parliamentary representative here in the colonies, Parliament just did this, and then the Americans didn't have any recourse. And that's where we get no taxation without representation, and where we also get the series of acts that we're going to be reading about this week that lead to the American Revolution. So it isn't that Great Britain was really a pain in the neck. It's that we had naturally grown into our own identity by the time this happens. And so we are really initially going to seek a new relationship with Great Britain, not like it was, but a new one, to which the king and Parliament are going to say, not happening here. And then, well, we know that rest of that story. Okay, remember, if you need anything, shoot me an email. Don't forget you've got a quiz coming up. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. Bye.